So welcome to our program today, Restoring Relationships and Beneficial Fire to Great Lake Forests. Dr. Evan Larson is going to share emerging research, weaving tree ring-based fire history information with Indigenous knowledge to tell a more complete and accurate story about the role of people and fire in shaping the forested landscapes of the upper Great Lakes, and in particular, the Boundary Waters and Canoe Area Wilderness. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the U.S. Forest Service for generously supporting this program. And just want to tell you a little bit about the Natural Areas Association. For those of you who may not know us, the NAA is a national nonprofit organization that serves those who steward the land to protect biodiversity. Our mission is to get quality science and best practices into the hands of those who can make an impact on the ground by sharing applied science, practical solutions, knowledge transfer through both in-person and digital opportunities. NAA's digital offerings include symposia, webinars featuring science-based natural areas conservation content. We release newly available programs every Friday at 11 on our YouTube channel. We publish the Natural Areas Journal quarterly, and we distribute the Natural Areas News twice a month. It's free. It's emailed directly to your inbox. NAA is available wherever you are located, wherever you are in your practice, wherever you are in your career, and whenever you have time. So now let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Evan Larson is a father, husband, teacher, scientist, and enthusiast of all wild places. Evan's childhood took place in the woods of central Minnesota, helping his parents tend 80 acres of mixed hardwood forests. Drawn by mountains, oceans, forests, and his formal education includes an environmental science bachelor's degree from Wilmette University, degrees in geography from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and the University of Minnesota. He's a faculty Fulbright fellowship at the Mid-Sweden University in Sundsvall. Evan has 23 years of experience using tree rings to investigate environmental history, including past patterns of climate disturbance and forest change. As professor and chair of the Department of Environmental Sciences and Society at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, Evan teaches courses that blur the lines between physical and cultural geography, and that are infused with undergraduate research in the search of transformative learning experiences. The work that is currently at the center of Evan's thoughts and energies, fueled by the enthusiasm of amazing collaborators who are together working to restore the interwoven relationships of people, fire, and pine in the Great Lake forests. So now I am going to turn it over to you, Evan, if you'd like to take over.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the introduction. Maria, can you see my screen okay?
Yes,
and can you hear me?
I can. Yes,
Excellent.
on both counts.
Okay, well, thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks so much, everybody, for taking time out of your day to be here. I really enjoy talking about this, and it's great to have an opportunity to share some ideas and then have some space for conversation and discussion at the end of this. Before I start, I do want to really emphasize that the work I'm going to share with you today is the product of just a huge number of folks really investing their time, energy, and spirit into this work. And so I'll share, the slides and the stories today, but please know that I'm just a tiny part of this, and that you will get to meet several of the folks who are doing this work over the course of the slides. But it's been a tremendous group. So when I was invited to give a talk to the Natural Areas Association, I like to think about, who is the audience, right? So go to the Natural Areas website, Natural Areas Association, which I should say I was aware of before this, but I'm excited to be here. We should read this to just refresh our memories, right? So the Natural Areas Association serves scientists and practitioners focused on the management of ecologically significant natural landscapes, with the intent to protect biodiversity for current and future generations. Protecting nature requires quality science and reliable resources to inform on-the-ground practices that can advance the conservation and stewardship of land and water. And I highlighted natural landscapes because I think that this is one of these just critical notions that so many of us carry as a really deep understanding of what that means. But I think sometimes because we see things through a human lens, it's a little tricky sometimes. And so I am speaking to you from the University of Wisconsin in Platteville, down in the heart of the Dreyfus area in southwest Wisconsin. Ho-Chunk land, Fox, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Oceti, Sakowin all have ancestral connections and contemporary connections to these landscapes. I grew up here in Malacca, and I want to go there because I think it starts to get at the sense of natural. Because looking at the landscape that shaped my understanding, my youth, you know, mixed hardwood forests, and right here, I'm going to put a little polygon on there. That you can barely see was the meadow that I used to help my parents burn when I was just a wee lad, and I always knew that burning was good. We were doing it intentionally to care for that little part of the landscape. But I think sometimes my understanding of that place surrounded by aspen and oak and maple doesn't reflect, say, what that landscape looked like 80 years earlier. And so that tiny little open meadow that we burned actually used to be part of this just really broad and widespread connected open area. And right down here, you can see an esker complex. And relevant to this study, there's a dot, black dot right here. And I was walking that, now it's covered with hardwood forest. Those dots are a pair of red pine, and the red pine are fire scarred. And so even though I didn't really recognize it, the things that we're going to talk about today, I've been living in this for a long time, and my baseline has not necessarily reflected the long term of the landscape that I've known. In my bio and intro, I did mention that I went to college at Willamette University out here in Salem, Oregon. And on this theme of natural, again, so great school. I was going to be a third grade science teacher, coach football. I was very excited about all that. And in between my junior and senior year, I was sidetracked by a research project. And this is an aerial image from the Cascades. And right here, you can see something that offers nice contrast to the rest of the landscape. So all those blocks, those are clear cuts. We're on the side of the Newberry volcano. Inside this circle, however, you can see fragmented landscape, but it's not because of clear cuts, it's because of lava flows. And if we go to that landscape, it's called the lava cast forest. And my undergraduate research experience that sent me down this road was looking at this landscape and looking at how fire propagates across this landscape and how the spatial structure of the forest influences fire as a process. And so these are very much islands of forest and a matrix of non-forest, using this as an analog for what the modern clear-cut landscape looks like. We're working with old growth fire-scarred ponderosa pine. It's really a beautiful experience. I got to work with grad students from Portland State University and other undergraduates from Willamette. And I got to do a lot of research and contribute to my first scientific publication. And I was just looking at that the other day as I was thinking about this talk, and the title is Fire History of a Naturally Fragmented Landscape in Central Oregon. And I was realizing that so often with that term natural, what we think about it and what we feel about it are sometimes different. And the idea in this case is that if we can understand the natural order of things, then we can maybe better manage this landscape that has been so influenced by people. And in that notion, though, we're starting to take people out of nature. And that's a really important idea that shapes a lot of how we do our work and a lot of how we think about the work we do. And so to get engagement, I'm going to ask to do a thought experiment here, a word association. And I'm going to say a word, and I'm going to ask you to drop into the chat the images that come to mind to you. You ready? Sometimes I ask people to close their eyes. It's hard to know on a computer if that's the case or not. But the word that I'm going to say is wilderness. Wilderness. Get a picture in your mind. And after you have that, start throwing words that resonate with you. And they're pouring in. This is great. I expected this group would be forthcoming with lots of ideas. Oh, yeah. I'm going to start clicking some slides, but keep them coming, because I see mountains. This is Glacier Lake up in the Eagle Cap wilderness out in northeastern Oregon. We've got people are thinking about open, vast, expansive. This is Granlandet, a wilderness area in northern Sweden. Oh, there we go. I see forests, and I think Linda captured an essence in a lot of what you're responding. But you're seeing this lack of people in this beautiful space. We'll go to the boundary waters here for a moment. And so my question then for you, and welcome conservation biology class, glad you're here. Balance, says Carrie. Did anybody see this? And the reason I ask is that this is a landscape photographed in the early 1900s on American Point in Basswood Lake, which is squarely in the heart of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness. Lack of people, Linda said, right? So all of a sudden we put people in and this doesn't feel like wilderness anymore. How many of you saw this? Does anybody know what this is? This is where I'm sad that I can't see you all, because I assume some of you know and you know right away, but I'll give you the hint, right? So Monty Python and the Holy Grail, yes. And so the reason I shared this is that the best class I took at college was my last year, and it was a course that explored the Grail legend. And it went from the earliest version of that myth all the way up through the modern time, and how that idea and those stories changed over time, and how they shaped the identity of England, and how they shape how people interact with each other and what they even expect and hope for the future. And so the story, of course, is that King Arthur is venturing out to find the Grail, and that the Grail is needed because the king is sick. And if they can find the Grail, they can heal the king. Interestingly, in the earlier versions of the tale, because the king is sick, the land is sick as well, showing this connection between people and the land. Again and again and again in these stories, they described the knights traveling off into the wasteland in search of the Grail. And they said it again and again and again, the wasteland. And so, you know, it's depicted in all these different ways. But that word really stuck with me. It's the name of a poem by T.S. Eliot that is also focused on the Grail legend, but it strikes at some of these themes and how we live and how we relate to each other. And so just for fun, you played with the wilderness game. Let's try one more. I'm going to say another word, and I want you to think of an image, what you see, and throw it into the chat again. And that word this time is wasteland. What do you see when you hear the word wasteland? Walmart. Industrial, toxic, desolate. Keep them coming in, and I'll put this one up. I found this online, and I felt like it's abstract enough where it captures so much of what you're all saying. The wasteland, right? This horrible place. Nobody wants to be here. The interesting thing, as I had this flash, this moment, this realization that when the knights were traveling out into the wasteland, this is always what I'm envisioned. But this is what they meant. Because at that time, wasteland was the land that was wasted. It wasn't being used to its highest end, right? And so all of a sudden, those terms right there shift around. They didn't have a word wilderness. That didn't come around until much later. You have people like Alexander von Humboldt in the 1800s starting to write just passionately about the natural world, about the beauty, about human impacts altering this land. He was one of the most famous people on the planet. He inspired the Romantic period or the Romantic painting effort. This is the Course of Empire by Thomas Cole, you know, showing this primal landscape with humans as a very minor component. To the earlier comments about wilderness, like this period of depicting these magnificent landscapes, and almost always humans are diminished. John Muir read Alexander von Humboldt. Henry David Thoreau read his work extensively, as did Charles Darwin, all of these people. And out of these ideas, at a time of kind of rampant industrialization, starts to come this notion of wilderness. Wildness is the preservation of the world from the forest, and wilderness come the tonics and barks which brace mankind. It is a social construct. It's an idea that we're using to try and express something, to capture something. And at the same time, that social construct can have some really devastating implications. American Progress by John Gast, capturing the essence of manifest destiny, right? The landscape needed to be empty so that we could fill it, right? Wilderness becomes this really powerful and political idea. And we were talking about this, and I had a wonderful opportunity. I was teaching a class with Robin Kimmerer, and we were talking about this, and I put this up, and we were speaking about models, and how we use that to inform understanding. And I had gone forward, and she said, Evan, would you please go back a slide? And I went to this, and she walked up, she pointed to this woman, and she looked at the audience, and she said, this could be my grandmother. And the whole class just kind of shuddered. Right? And so when we think about these words and the power they have to shape our understanding of the world, our expectations, it's really valuable to start reflecting on all these little tiny subtle ways that these notions kind of work into our mindset. And what better place to do that than the Boundary Waters? I hope that many of you have been there. If you haven't, that you have an opportunity. So it's a federal wilderness area, no motorized transportation. So you go by canoe, which is the way that people have interacted with this landscape for millennia. Sigurd Olson, who is a huge advocate for wilderness and the Wilderness Act, talks about this as a place where, you know, your decisions have consequence. Like, Lane, don't paddle into the storm. Where, you know, you are living in that space where people are reduced to their more insignificant roles. And so when you spend time here, it's easy to start thinking about, say, the Wilderness Act that states that wilderness is an area where the earth and community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. And right there, as many of you probably know and think about, like, this is not true. This map shows you the First Nation reserves in Canada and the reservations in the US of Anishinaabe communities who have direct connections to these landscapes for centuries. We know that in these communities, they engaged with the landscape in important and formative ways. This is a photo from the early 1900s in northern Minnesota or Wisconsin. It's titled The Blueberry Camp. You can see char on the base of these red pine that are open grown, widespread. Interviews with elders up in Canada talk about the use of fire, ishkode, to tend blueberry patches because it's recognized that that promotes a rich harvest. And so when you see these berries, you're recognizing that this landscape is not a wilderness necessarily, but then how do you express that in a way that that fits with our Western perspective and mindset? When stories aren't enough, how do you show this? And so that was part of the inspiration in this project when we first started off. So that's Lane Johnson in the front, Liz Schneider, who is a grad student at the University of Minnesota at the time, and Ben Mathias, who's a former student of mine from Platteville. Went into the Boundary Waters. We looked for stands like this. This is an open grown red pine stand. And we went in and specifically seeking out evidence of fire. So these are fire scarred, old growth red pine on Crooked Lake. If you look closely at the fire scars, you can start to see that history of fire. And Bud Heinzelman, who I would love to talk about a long time, did this incredible work with fire history at this massive landscape scale. But when you look closer at some of these trees, you can see my mouse here. This right here, this curving lobe, that's the first fire that scarred this tree. Here's the second, so that's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 fires that burned by this tree during its lifetime that scarred it but did not kill it. So it's already telling you these are not the stand replacing fires that we think of for this system. You can also see the tiny thin healing lobes, which lets you know that these fires are occurring in rapid succession. It's wilderness, so we did not sample any living trees. When we found stumps like this, however, we could do the work. Crosscut saws. And you open these up, and Pinus resinosa, as the Latin name, really rings true because this wood is just packed with resin around the injuries. solid after being dead for a long time. You sand this up through the process of cross dating, looking like the narrow ring in 1752 with thick late wood, the false ring in 1747, the micro ring in 1804 and 1821 is another narrow ring. You can start to see when these rings were growing, even though the sample has been dead for a long time. And every single one of these curving black lobes represents a year that that tree recorded a fire during its lifetime, carrying that story. And so with this sample that was collected on a tiny island in this massive Lake Saginaw, we now know that the inner ring, this tree started growing in 1679. The outer ring is 1989. And that it recorded fires in the years 1702, 1718, 1743, 1758, 1770, 1780, 1795, 1823, 1842, and 1850, at which point lightning must have stopped striking this tiny island because it's wilderness. And I used to say that and laugh. And it wasn't until a little bit later that I really realized this is in the 1854 ceded territory. We'll talk more about that. This is a culturally modified pine that we started encountering more and more often. It was usually co-associated with fire scars. I used to think this was Boy Scouts hacking on trees, but then we found that there are way too many of them. You can see tool marks, and all of a sudden looking at the thickness of those lobes around the scar face, and started to think that these are much, much older. Talked with folks from the Forest Service, as well as some of the Anishinaabe communities in this area, to recognize that these are trees that had their bark removed. Intentionally. You can see the tool marks, and you can see that resin boiling up around the edge of the tree, or around the edge of the scar. And I used to quote Frances Densmore, a really well-known ethnobotanist who did an immense amount of work in this region. She talked about how it would be customary to scrape bark from the trees in the spring and then go back and harvest the resin. But I can also talk to Jeff Savage, who's a master canoe builder with a Fond du Lac Band, and he'll tell me the same thing. And so with those stories, then going back and seeing on the faces of some of these peels, literally the etching of all that scraped the resin. And when you find a dead and down, permission to sample, just like with the fire scars. We now know that this tree had its bark peeled in the spring of the year 1800. We looked at demographic information through age structure analysis and put together an incredible data set. This is a map showing you everywhere that we went in blue lakes. Green is primary forest. It's primarily where we searched because that's where the old trees were, had not been blown over, logged down, or burned. Red dots show you everywhere we found a fire scar. Red circles show where we collected age structure data. Yellow circles show you where we encountered culturally modified trees. In all, it was 211 lakes. We collected 414 fire scarred samples, 246 culturally modified trees documented, 32 age structure plots that included about 1,100 trees for age structure data. And so this is what we found. And importantly, to go back, so the border route is labeled, and that's been a long-term travel corridor used for millennia based off archaeological records. And you can see now, if we look at tree ring samples that were collected along the border route, which is the lower cluster, versus away from the border route, the upper cluster. And we look at where each of these tree ring samples, represented by a horizontal line, records a fire, which is represented by a red dot. You can see that there's an immense amount of fire, and that there's more fire along the border route than off of the border route. We can calculate the number of fires recorded over time at the bottom. We can add the peel dates for the trees that we were able to sample and assign dates to the cultural modifications. We overlap that, and it lines up almost exactly with the fire occurrence. We can put the first written mention of Anishinaabe settlement on Crane Lake on the western side of the study area, after this land was contested between the Anishinaabe and the Lakota. And then you put on the Nelson Act, which closely followed the Dawes Act and required all off-reservation Anishinaabe to be removed to the White Earth Reservation on the west side of Minnesota. And all of a sudden, this does not look so much like a wilderness. So then the truth of it is that not everybody who was living on this landscape moved to White Earth. So then why did the fires stop? And there's really stark evidence in a photograph taken in 1906 along the border route between the US and Canada. So this is in the almost established Superior National Forest. And if we close in, the sign forbids setting fire to the woods and forbids leaving any fires unextinguished, at risk of a $5,000 fine or imprisonment for 2 years. $5,000 in 1906. If you do the math, that is a lot of money. And so this, along with boarding schools and reservations and political shifts, directly affected the people who were living on this landscape. That is a process that you could call untrammling, using the words of the Wilderness Act. And if you then look at this wilderness area and start thinking about what happens after people are removed, and again, looking at those fires, this is not Smokey Bear putting fires out. Fire suppression is not effective in this region until the 1930s. This is the removal of ignitions. If we then overlay the age structure data to this graph, you can see this incredible pulse of tree establishment that begins in the late 1800s, peaks in the 1900s, and diminishes. Traveling in the boundary waters, you now see sites that look like this. These are 250-year-old red pine that are surrounded by 100-year-old ladder fuels. If you were out in the western US, you would expect this stand to burn in a high-intensity fire the next time, even though these red pine have survived 10 to 12 fires already in their lifespan. To go to a place like Fish Stake Narrows, where we encountered over 70 culturally modified trees in a single stand, and then to look at the structure of this forest that changes after those fires stop. I'm going to color code these trees. Red are pre-1800s, yellow trees were established during the 1800s, and then everything else that's blue is from the 1900s. And you can see that what once used to be an open stand has now very much grown in with the cessation of burning. And so looking at this landscape, it's interesting to think, like, it's not that people necessarily created ecological pattern from scratch. It's not trying to turn a black spruce swamp into an open stand of red pine. But by engaging with certain places at certain times, humans amplified currently existing patterns. Not every stand of red pine is there because of people, but there are more there because of the way people enacted with those landscapes. And so to put this into a theoretical construct, if you look at mesic wet to xeric dry sites across the boundary waters and expect this might be a distribution of plant communities in the absence of people and fire, when you introduce humans and fire, it shifts that distribution. And you have more kind of xeric forest community types on sites that would be richer. And you're potentially creating these novel conditions. I'd assume many of you are familiar with the term mesophication. This is almost the opposite. It's almost like xerification, that people are pushing these systems into these drier communities through the introduction of fire. And so when we look at the wilderness in the boundary waters and recognize that this is the highest level of protection that we can provide land in the United States, and we look at the red pine that are being swallowed up by balsam fir, and we can recognize that these pines will not be here into the future. And I can say that with tremendous confidence, at least not in the way that they were in the past. We surveyed 5,540 square meters of the most beautiful red pine forests in the boundary waters for regeneration. We found 8 seedlings over the entire area. This is the highest level of protection we can offer. So who is it protected for? For me, this helped me understand that these are not wilderness sites. These are socio-ecological systems that are expression of long-term engagement with the landscape. This is not the wasteland. This is wilderness. Words become confusing. And you see these lessons in the boundary waters, and you can take that elsewhere, right? So go across to Quetico, connect with members of Laclacroix First Nation, go and visit a site, have a fish fry. That's a very important first step. And then visit a site near a pictograph location, south-facing slope, red pine with fire scars, culturally modified trees. Spend the day out with the kids from that reserve, and then hear stories from Danny about how, yeah, his grandpa used to have a cabin out here and take care of this place. This is where they gathered medicine. You can go to the headwaters of the Mississippi River and see the fire-scarred stands that Henry Schoolcraft encountered after discovering this place while being led there by Oza Windib, who lived and hunted on this landscape. the Brule River in northern Wisconsin. Calvin Coolidge had a lovely cabin assemblage, which is now this beautiful complex of cabins and resorts, tucked along the Brule River, surrounded by old growth red pine, fire scarred, further surrounded by 100-year-old balsam fir thicket with fire scarred faces chopped like this, and talking with the owners, are like, oh yeah, there was an old Ojibwe guy who used to make canoes who lived just over there. And these stories then become more and more personal. This is my family's cabin, is where I was on sabbatical during the whole time that we were doing the big push on this Boundary Waters project. It was wonderful. My kids had a 1.5 mile walk to the school bus. In the fall on the road. In the spring we could paddle. In the winter we ice skated and skied. But on those shoulder seasons we had to find another route, and so we started walking through the woods. And then go by my neighbor's yard and be like, oh, that's a fire scarred red pine. And recognize that the same story that we're finding in the Boundary Waters and all these other places has literally been right next to my family's cabin that I've been going to for my entire life. And then now we have a fire history at Crooked Lake with fires in 1804, 1825, 1835, 1845, 1860, 65, 75, 90, and 1898. At which point a resort went in on 2 lakes over and the fire stopped. So at my own cabin, this place that I thought I knew, and I look now and see these red pine over this thicket of some red oak and sugar maple, and recognize that the same stories are playing out in this landscape, and that my kids are certainly not the first kids to swim in these waters. And now it's personal. And so I'm going to wrap up with a description of the work that we've been collaborating on, just kind of taking this and thinking about again. So again and again and again, we go to these places. These are some of the locations we've collected fire history data. There are more that other researchers have done, as well as additional sites that we've done and we haven't dated yet. And these are the fire charts. And so again and again and again, at all these places, we have fire through the 1700s, 1800s, up into the 1900s, and then the fire stopped. And so from a scientific perspective, the question is, can you now build a model off of these observations? If the stories of people sharing burning are not enough for us to know and trust, then let's take it from the Western perspective, right? Let's go to the head of Lake Superior. This place that is well known and well loved by many, many, many people, that the Natural Areas Association actually had a conference just a couple summers ago that I missed. I was sad to do so. And we look at this pathway of water that connects here at the Great Lakes out to the Atlantic Ocean and compare it to some of these other maps that are around. And this is one version of a story shared among a number of Anishinaabe communities about the movement of the Anishinaabe from the Atlantic Ocean through the Great Lakes to where the food grows from the water. The arrows show you the direction that they've traveled, and there are 7 stopping places indicated on this map. Point 6, Spirit Island, is in the estuary of the St. Louis River, where it comes out into Lake Superior. At the intersection of those waters, this landform, Minnesota Point and Wisconsin Point, span the head of Lake Superior. There is pine on that point. It is a known location of cultural importance. And it is if those stories come together and we go out here after all of this work elsewhere, will we see the same thing? Will we see the pines that then tell the stories of the people who have been living in this place? And so it was a couple of years back, the Wisconsin Sea Grant Program put out a call, and they were looking for projects that targeted justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion for underrepresented coastal communities. A group of us thought, well, so let's take a gamble and let's go out and let's do this project on this site. If we find fire scars and fire history that support this notion, then we have an incredibly powerful case study. If not, then we have to think about what we're understanding and how we interpret this information. We put together a statement of shared purpose that we would approach this with open hearts and minds. And then we turn to the people who actually did the work. And this is a group of students from Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College who took on the challenge of developing a fire history out on Minnesota Point and Wisconsin Point. And so we went out onto the point, and this is over the last 1.5 years now. And we looked for stumps, the same as elsewhere. Mocha would describe it as a kick test. You kick to see if it's solid. If it is, it's probably resinous, which means it's probably red pine. Hand tools, because we're working in Minnesota science and natural area, so think about it as wilderness, to open up these stumps. And something that looks like this, solid, to take that sample and then to have Val hold this and recognize that it's the bottom edge of a cultural modification. And then it was collected about 100 yards from where we believe Chief Osagie, signatory on the 1854 treaty and a master canoe builder, lived, to recognize that that scar may have been put on this tree by his hands. Collected fire scars from trees, including some outside of the protected area, with a chainsaw, but it was electric, so it was quiet, and put together this incredible data set. Cord trees to develop reference chronologies to help date the samples from stumps, and then to tell the story. And so this group did an amazing job. We had incredible support from the estuarium, Lake Superior National Estuarian Research Reserve, to set up a temporary dendrochronology lab. The Duluth Makerspace offered up their shop so that we could process our samples. Students learned how to sand and prepare tree ring samples and get them ready for analysis, and then to look at them under the scope. Looking at something like this from a Western perspective, you can see tree growth, the beginning of the 1804 growing season, the end of the 1804 growing season, and a fire scar in the later part of the growth ring. I would say this is a late season fire scar. Students said it's a blueberry burn. You can see resin impregnating the injury behind a fire scar. I see it's a response to traumatic injury. Students say, "Big U, this is what you make canoes with." Pith, or is it the start of the universe where the creator shakes a rattle and the sound waves come forth? Radial files of cells, or is it beadwork? In addition to the work in the lab, we partnered with the Godot Camp, a K-12 science program at Fond du Lac, and they helped sample, or they helped reanalyze core samples that were collected for a previous study by the Minnesota DNR and make graphs and turn it into science. These are the locations we worked. Yellow triangles are documented culturally modified trees through the Wisconsin Historical Society in our own work. Red circles are fire scars, white dots are cores. Red circles also include some culturally modified trees we sampled. The story that emerges. These are the extents of the tree ring samples from the site. Onagumingson is Minnesota Point. Jagawamakong-Neashi is Wisconsin Point. These are the fires that were recorded. This is the cumulative fire count. These are the peel scar dates. These are the treaty dates that govern these two properties, these two landscapes. We layer on age structure, and you see a pulse of pine establishment immediately following the cessation of fire that ceased following the 1842 and 1854 treaties. We see a transition from pine and green and red to the circles indicating hardwoods. This is the age structure. It is the same story, except it happened 50 years earlier because of proximity of contact. And it's fascinating to see how we see these things and recognize that in describing this site and to help establish this as a science and natural area for the Minnesota DNR, statements like the uneven age nature of the red pine component of the stand, probably due to its presence on sand dunes, is unusual for a species that usually regenerates for a short time following fire. The fact that the stand is uneven aged suggests the stand will require little management to maintain the pine components of the stand well into the future. Equally important is the fact that much of the pine stand has maintained its ecological integrity in spite of a history of human disturbance. When really what it is because of this history. You look at a historical photograph, the largest log raft on the planet at this time. You can see logs piled higher than buildings from the North Shore. And then in the background, you capture what Minnesota Point looked like when it was a fire-maintained pine woodland that was one of the most important blueberry gathering grounds for Anishinaabe in this region for centuries. This is what it looks like today. This is what it looks like today. My sampling strategy was I was going to offer $1 for every red pine seedling that the students found, and I kept all of my money. And you don't just see the change in structure, you see a loss in important plants used to make traditional tobacco. You see diminished blueberry harvests surrounded by poison ivy. And you see that history living on this landscape that's still tangible, these connections that have stayed, the stories who have stayed in these places, even when the people stepped away. And so this history has shaped what we think of when we see natural, right? Where rare species are protected, and where we can know and study Minnesota's fascinating natural features. Does that include people? The way forward, and I'll wrap up here. I see that I've talked for 53 minutes, but maybe that includes the 15 minutes that I came on before, so I'm not as late as I think. I can't see a clock. There is a shift that is happening, and it's slow, but it's rapidly growing. There's a cultural burn on Stockton Island in Apostle Islands National Lake Shore several years ago. That burn was a collaboration among cultures and nations, and it was the first fire to return to that place with this intent in century. And what was so amazing is to see the way that people gathered around this, to reconsider how we think about these places and how we think about human engagement with them. And it's so fascinating because there was a tree ring study that helped advance that work. There's a pollen study and charcoal study that looked at long-term records of charcoal in some of the wetlands on Stockton Island. This graph just shows you charcoal to reconstruct fire history, vegetation from pollen. And what was so interesting is after all of this work, you could also talk to the people to recognize that as this fire is starting to be reintroduced in 2017 on Uisa-Kotawan Minnes, that name literally means the place where the trunks of the trees are half burned, charred on one side because of surface fires. You can see places like at the University of Minnesota Cloquet Forestry Center. The boundaries are identified on this map. Importantly, within the boundaries of the Fond du Lac Reservation, acquired through allotment. I was there with a student group to develop fire history. Again, old fire-scarred red pines surrounded by balsam. These are the locations of the fire scars that we sampled. This is the GLO survey to show pine barrens in a place that now looks like a forest, to show an old Indian village just across the river. And then you look at the fire history, you see fires through the 1700s, 1800s. The stop in 1909, the year that the Forest Center was established. And you share this with somebody like Jeff Savage and say, Jeff, I see this, and to me it looks like an interrupted indigenous fire regime, but I don't want to speak out of place. Does this make sense? And his response, you're just telling me what I already know. And to see that by engaging around fire, that you can emerge into these collaborative conversations and that you can begin to do that work of healing our conceptions of ourselves as well as our relationships with others. It was just a couple of years ago now, led by Fond du Lac, Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, BIA, tribal members from across Minnesota and elsewhere, as well as the University of Minnesota. They returned fire to the Camp 8 Old Growth Stand of Red Pine for the first time in a long time. And you can think about these trees that have been growing for a century, casting seed down on a landscape that is unreceptive to their children. And think about, as we begin to recognize the trauma of land separation for people, think about the trauma that that expresses in these plants as well, who've lived with fire for their evolutionary history, and to have that gone. An important note, collaboration on fire is helping, it's not inspiring, but it is helping shape conversations around the University of Minnesota returning the Cloquet Forestry Center land, 3,400 acres of research forest, to the Fond du Lac Band. These are some of the ways forward. And so to look at a point like Minnesota Point, to recognize this long-term history, to recognize that when we think about climate resiliency, diversity of forest, diversity of people, that we're starting to consider the relationships that perhaps once kind of hidden underneath as being, we'll say, natural. And so I assume a lot of you have read this book. And the example of sweetgrass, this place where reciprocity emerges, that when you engage with these other beings on this landscape in a mindful way, they benefit. But if you ignore those relationships, they will fade. Is it not the same thing with red pine? Is red pine not an expression of relationship and that expanded niche created through fire that shaped the forests the Europeans encountered as wilderness and now are protecting them as such? And so to come back to close out, so the Natural Areas Association serves scientists and practitioners. We read that statement, right? The next paragraph, I think, is also really relevant. When it comes to conservation, acquiring land or putting it under conservation easement is only the first step. The protection of natural areas demands careful planning, regular monitoring, and constant vigilance. Long-term protection includes intervention against threats that imperil the ecological biodiversity and the restoration of species that are waning or have been lost in a particular system. Are people part of these species that in some cases are diminished, at least in some of the ways that we can impact places? And if you look at this and you think about the migration of the Anishinaabe, and you overlay, say, a map like this. Some of you may know what this is offhand. For the rest, it is the range of Bapakwanagama. That's red pine. And it is the same. These beings have been living next to each other for a long time. And those relationships then are expressed in this landscape and in who we are. And so the reason that I'm arguing in this way is that I think that we so often, even when we recognize good stewardship, we associate human impacts with bad, and that we recognize that that by protection, we often mean keep people out. And yet we also know that these same systems have developed in the presence of human engagement for millennia, since time immemorial. And so can we think about wilderness, not in the way that perhaps unpeopled, but what about in the way of a trail crew walking with elders and drip torches, pointing to peninsulas and islands and setting fire to those places? And then in the wakes of those fires are emerging the foods and the medicines that benefit the people and that place. Can that also be wilderness? And so really in closing now, the project that started in the Boundary Waters has expanded so much. We now are in the process of executing a new grant from the National Science Foundation. 8 of us are the core PI, representing a diversity of groups. We have about 50 project partners, some of whom I believe I saw on the participant list here today. And we're going through a process of having conversations with Indigenous communities, with fire ecologists, fire practitioners, and knowledge holders to start talking about what are the questions that these communities have around fire, and what are the ways that we can work together to start to answer them. To really bring together the required expertise to engage with this from a holistic perspective, to see this with 2 eyes, to bring together both Western science as well as Indigenous knowledge to understand a good way forward. And so this is where we've worked, well, we've begun at Fond du Lac. Over the next year, we're going to be hosting a series of listening sessions. These are the locations that we have identified thus far, with a few more to go, as well as some online conversations. And so with this group, I know there's so many people having these conversations in so many places that we're excited to start building these relationships. And I hope that this can be part of the conversation from the discussion. But for now, I will say Nimwanji Idamingi Watashkadeng, which was the name of the Sea Grant project. That roughly translates to together we are gathering around the fire. And that's what we found again and again and again, that this is a process to start sharing some of our conversations, some of our feeling, and to begin healing that's been needed for a long time. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much. I talked longer than I anticipated, but I hope there's some time for a little bit of conversation here. I'm happy to stick around after the noon hour.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. That we actually, I don't know if everyone else is reflecting as I am, just throughout the whole thing. Wow. If you, we started with a word game. If you want to throw in a word that you're reflecting on as you've listened to this presentation, please feel free to throw it into chat. I'm also.
Why are you got muted?
I did, sorry. I just put in chat the link to some other resources. Evan has a wonderful page he's put together for all of you. We do have a few minutes. We have a couple questions. If you've thought of a question and you want to put it in Q&A, please do. And we'll just give Evan a chance to answer them. So the first one is, what were these areas like before the 1700s and increased fire frequency of the next 150 years?
Craig, that's a great idea, a great question, and we wrestle with that a lot. So I'm a dendrochronologist by training, which means I use tree rings. And in that case, I'm a little bit limited in the temporal perspective that I can engage with. And you can see if we jump back to, say, this fire chart, you can see there's less fire activity prior to the 1736 line that I drew. So this was a contested landscape during that period. There's a lot of conflict between the Lakota and the Anishinaabe. So the type of relationships with landscape were a little bit different. You can see there were still fires, but there were not as many. We do not believe that this is an expression of simply lower sample depth, because, I mean, we actually have hundreds of samples through that period. And if we go over to, say, this chart, you can see that there really is an uptick across this whole region in the early 1700s. Talking with our Anishinaabe collaborators, there's a lot of conversation about why people would burn. And so we understand that. The longer term perspective of what was like before that, I think, is a great opportunity, kind of what we're hoping is to come out of the current grant project. Thinking about some of the long-term perspectives from the charcoal records, thinking about differences in cultural engagement with landscape, different uses of fire. All of these things factor into what that landscape looked like. The other question is, there may be some evidence that it's possible that in these places the landscape was simply that much more open, that we simply that they were so much more substantially open, and that fuel loads were so light that perhaps those fires aren't being recorded in all of these trees. But we're excited to kind of link stories, charcoal records with some of these locations that show up as persistent places in the tree record to get that longer term perspective, and to start kind of describing that in more detail. We also have some modeling efforts that are starting up to think about how we can use that approach, as well as expanding the network of fire history across a broader region to see if these patterns show up consistently across different locations. So it's a great question. It's a huge, hugely important line to pursue. And we're excited for the work to come out of that. Kind of stumbled, but happy to talk more about that. Yeah.
So we do have one more question and a few more minutes. So Jason's question is, why did white pines thrive prior to the arrival of the Anishinaabe? I'm not pronouncing that. Anishinaabe. Even though fires were found to be as uncommon as after the reservations were formed and fire restrictions were implemented, what difference in conditions allowed white pine samplings to survive during the earlier period?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jason. And so one of the things that I want to really emphasize in dendrochronology is this thing called the fading record issue, right? So dead trees die, and well, once they're dead, they will slowly decompose. Resin slows that process, but we have less representation of the fire history in this early part of the record. However, in the samples that we do have, we have evidence of fires kind of occurring throughout that period. And so even though we have fewer samples, and this chart at the bottom of the page doesn't have as tall of lines, we still know that there were frequent fires throughout that period, and charcoal records kind of bear this out. When you compare it to the occurrence of fire over the modern record, especially over the last 70 to 80 years, it's pretty dramatically different. In charcoal records, you also see kind of this big kind of break in fire occurrence. And so fires were happening. They were not as well represented in the records that we have. And one of the interesting things is that what we're finding is when you have that really high fire frequency, it creates the conditions that allow red pine to persist. And there's some great work on regeneration patterns and things like that. White pine can establish with a little bit thicker duff layer. And so a lot of the encroachment into the red pine stands that used to have frequent fires are actually that first generation of tree establishment as white pines that are starting to come into those spaces. And so what I would say is most likely at the red pine sites, you had the highest fire frequency. White pine sites, it was perhaps a more intermediate frequency. And then when you get into the stands of aspen and jack pine, that would be kind of the lower fire frequency. So the key is that fire was part of this system for as long as these plants have been here, basically.
So we did have one more question come in. I know we're right about the top of the hours, but we'll get this one in. Any recommendations on reaching out to tribal fire practitioners? We're in Illinois, so no reservations in the state, but we have few folks who've connected with through developing land acknowledgements and many other indigenous folks in urban areas. We'd like to start conversations with tribal land managers regarding conducting cultural, traditional prescribed fires on public land. Do you have any recommendations there?
Yeah, it's a long and important process, and it starts with relationships and conversations. Depends the community. Gifts may be appropriate, maybe not. And one of the challenges is that in a lot of these cases, when you look at the cultural disruption, there are places where people do not remember the stories in the same way that maybe they do in other locations. And so it becomes a really difficult conversation with a lot of emotions, can be really loaded, but it's also really important. And so in some ways, some of the conversations, it's very much a process of shared remembering. And I don't think that because it's hard, you shouldn't do it. So with respect to the time, I'll say, keep up the good efforts and make sure you do it with a good heart. And I will end there, and happy to take emails or continue correspondence as we go forward.
Terrific. Well, Evan, thank you so much. I have shared the screen with the QR code for your additional resources. I also put a link in chat, and a recording of this presentation will be sent to everyone who is registered so that you can revisit it as needed. I'll also share Evan's email information so that if you have follow-on questions later. Thank you so much, Evan. This was a wonderful presentation. And I know I learned a lot and just shifted perspectives. And I think that's what it's all about, having open hearts, and as you mentioned. So thank you. And thank you everyone for being here today. We appreciate it. And we'll see you hopefully for our next NAA program. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.